The wind howled through the empty valley, carrying dust and debris from a distant explosion. The valley was once a thriving alien colony, now reduced to nothing but a field of rubble and twisted metal. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint crunching sound of boots on the dry earth. It had been a few days since the disaster, but the haunting image of the destroyed colony still lingered in the mind of the protagonist, a man named Daniel. He was a skilled engineer and scavenger, known for his ability to find valuable resources in the most unlikely places. But this was different. This was something far more than the usual wreckage. Daniel had heard rumors about the alien colony that once stood here. It was one of the first extraterrestrial settlements Earth had come into contact with. A peaceful colony of aliens who had sought refuge on their new homeworld. They had built a society of technology and peace, much like humans had once dreamed of doing. But now, it was all gone. As he made his way through the ruins, Daniel couldn't help but feel a sense of loss. He wasn't an emotional man, but the sight of the wreckage, a place that had once been home to countless lives, left him with a strange emptiness. The colony, which had once looked so promising, was nothing but a distant memory now. All that was left were the twisted remains of buildings and the faint echo of a civilization lost. His scanner beeped, signaling that he was near the center of the destruction. He stopped for a moment, scanning the area, looking for anything that might be of value. There was no sign of life, no sign of survivors. But as his eyes swept over the broken building, something caught his attention. It was faint at first, barely audible against the wind, a sound that seemed out of place. Crying. Daniel froze, his heart racing. He hadn't expected to find anything alive here, especially not after the reports he had heard. The colony had been destroyed in a massive attack, leaving no survivors, or so they thought. He turned towards the sound, his instincts kicking in. He moved quickly but cautiously, his boots kicking up dust as he navigated the fallen beams and shattered glass. The closer he got, the clearer the sound became. It was soft, broken, like the sound of someone who had given up, yet still held onto a shred of hope. Then, under a pile of rubble, he saw her. At first, Daniel thought it was a trick of the light, but as he moved the debris away, his heart sank. There, curled up and trembling, was a small alien girl. She couldn't have been more than 12 or 13 in human years, though her appearance was unlike anything Daniel had seen before. Her skin was a pale, shimmering blue, and her hair, what was left of it, was a deep shade of silver. Her large eyes, glowing faintly like stars, were filled with tears. She was covered in dust and debris, her small body bruised and battered. Daniel's mind raced. How was this possible? How had she survived? The colony had been wiped out by a force far beyond anything Earth had ever encountered. The thought that a single child might have survived this nightmare was almost unbelievable. Without thinking, Daniel knelt beside her, his voice soft but urgent. "Hey, are you okay?" he asked, his voice a little shakier than he intended. The girl looked up at him, her large eyes filled with fear. For a moment she didn't speak, just stared at him with wide, frightened eyes. Then her lips parted, but no words came out. She tried to speak, but only a soft whimper escaped. It was clear that she was in shock, struggling to comprehend what had happened. Daniel didn't know what to do. He had never been trained to handle situations like this. He was an engineer, not a rescuer, but he couldn't leave her here, not like this. He gently reached out and helped her sit up, his hands steady even as his heart pounded in his chest. "Can you tell me what happened?" Daniel asked, though he wasn't sure she would understand. He had no idea what language the aliens spoke, and the translator device he carried wasn't going to be much help in this situation. The girl didn't answer him. She simply clung to his arm, her small hands trembling. Daniel sighed, looking around at the devastation. He had no idea how she had survived, or what kind of destruction had come to this place. He had to get her out of here, back to safety. But the question remained, where was safety? The valley was a ghost town, a place of death and ruin. There were no other survivors, no sign of any other aliens. The entire colony had been wiped out, but the girl was alive, and that, in itself, was a mystery. Daniel lifted her gently in his arms, careful not to disturb her injuries too much. As he started moving toward a safer part of the valley, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to this than just a random attack. Whoever had destroyed the colony had left no survivors for a reason. And now, it seemed that the only living being left was this alien girl. He wasn't sure why he felt this way, but he couldn't shake the feeling that her survival meant something. Something important. "Don't worry," Daniel whispered softly, his voice more to himself than to her. "I'll get you out of here." The girl's body trembled in his arms, but she didn't resist. She just held onto him tightly as though he were the last thread of hope she had. As they walked through the valley, Daniel's mind raced. He didn't know what had happened to her people or what kind of enemy had attacked. But he couldn't ignore the fact that he was now the protector of the last surviving member of an entire alien race. And that thought filled him with a sense of responsibility, even if he didn't fully understand what that responsibility meant yet. The journey away from the ruins was longer than Daniel had expected. The air was dry and thin, making each step heavier than the last. The alien girl, still in his arms, had grown quieter. She no longer whimpered or cried, but her grip on his jacket remained tight, as if she were afraid to let go. Daniel had made a decision. He would get her to a safe place, somewhere far from the destruction. But as he walked, he couldn't stop thinking about the girl's strange, pale blue skin, her wide eyes, and the deep sadness that seemed to radiate from her. She had lost everything, and he had no idea what to do next. After several hours of walking, they arrived at a small, abandoned building on the edge of the valley. It was one of the few places that had survived the chaos. Daniel gently laid the girl down on a clean piece of floor, making sure she was comfortable. He didn't know how much time had passed since she was trapped under the rubble, but she looked exhausted. Her breathing was shallow, and her eyes fluttered shut. He took a step back, unsure of what to do next. His first priority was getting her to a medical facility, but that would be difficult. He wasn't even sure if there were any other survivors. His world had just gotten much more complicated. Daniel pulled out a small medical kit from his bag and began to tend to her wounds. She had cuts and bruises all over her arms and legs, and her clothes were torn. He carefully cleaned the dirt and debris from her skin, applying a mild antiseptic. The girl stirred slightly but didn't wake up. Daniel worked in silence, trying his best not to disturb her. As he finished, he found a blanket in the corner of the room and draped it over her, hoping she would feel a little warmer. He sat down across from her, leaning against the wall. He was exhausted. The weight of the situation had hit him harder than he expected. How had she survived when everyone else was gone? Was there more to her than met the eye? He looked at her, closely. There was something about her, something different. She was no ordinary alien. Her skin shimmered and her features were delicate, almost fragile. But there was a strength in her eyes, a resilience that didn't match the sadness in her face. She had lost everything, yet she had survived. That fact alone made Daniel believe she was more than just a survivor. There was something important about her, something that could change everything. Hours passed, and the girl slowly awoke, her eyelids fluttering open. At first she seemed confused, looking around the room as if she didn't know where she was. Then her eyes met Daniel's, and for a moment, there was a flicker of recognition. Her gaze softened, and she tried to sit up, wincing from the pain in her body. "Take it easy," Daniel said softly, his voice calm and reassuring. "You're safe here." The girl looked at him for a long moment, her large eyes searching his face. She said something in a language Daniel didn't understand, her voice weak and strained. He shook his head, apologizing silently. He wished he could help her more, but there was so much he didn't know. "I don't know your language," Daniel said gently, "but I'll figure it out. We'll get through this together." The girl didn't respond right away. She looked down at her hands as if deep in thought, then slowly reached for a small device at her side. It was a communication tool, but it was nothing like the technology Daniel had seen before. It was simple, small, and worn, but it had a calming effect on the girl as she held it close. She pressed a few buttons, and soon the device emitted a series of beeps. A voice, soft and melodic, echoed from the device. "Are you the last?" the voice asked in a language Daniel could understand, though it sounded foreign, distorted, like it was being translated. "The others, they are gone?" The girl's face fell at the sound of the voice, her tears welling up once more. She nodded slowly, her small hands gripping the device tightly. Daniel could see the weight of the question in her eyes. She wasn't just asking about her people's fate. She was asking about the future. "Yes," she said softly, her voice barely audible. "I am the last of my people." The words hit Daniel harder than he expected. The loss, the despair in her voice was real, and it shook him to his core. He had heard about colonies being destroyed before, but he had never encountered something so personal. The alien girl wasn't just a survivor. She was the last of her kind. That thought felt heavy, like a mountain on his shoulders. "I'm sorry," Daniel said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "I didn't know." The girl shook her head, as though she didn't want him to feel pity for her. Her eyes met his once more, this time with a look of determination. She wasn't just a victim of circumstance. She was a fighter. She had lived through something unimaginable, and now she had to face an uncertain future. "Where do you come from?" Daniel asked, his curiosity finally breaking through the heavy silence. "How did you end up here?" The girl hesitated, then slowly began to speak, her words still soft but clearer now that she had the device to communicate. "My colony. We lived in peace, far from here. We were small, hidden, not meant to be found. But one day, they came, and we were destroyed. They took everything, killed everyone, except me. I hid. I was too weak to fight. But I lived, and I don't know why." Daniel listened intently, the story she shared unfolding like a terrible dream. The attackers, whoever they were, hadn't just destroyed her home. They had wiped out her entire way of life. Her people had been peaceful, but that didn't matter to those who had come for them. "What kind of people did this to you?" Daniel asked, his voice low with anger. "Who would destroy an entire colony like that?" The girl's face twisted in pain, but she didn't answer. Instead, she turned her gaze toward the window, as if searching for something beyond the walls of the room. "They are enemies," she said finally. "They do not care for our peace. They destroy to take. They leave nothing behind." Daniel clenched his fists. The idea of anyone, alien or human, destroying an entire colony was unfathomable. But he knew one thing for certain. This girl wasn't just a survivor of a lost world. She was a symbol of everything that was wrong with the universe. And he was going to help her find justice. "We'll figure this out," Daniel said, his voice steady. "I don't know how, but we'll get to the bottom of it. You're not alone." For the first time since Daniel had found her under the rubble, the girl's expression softened. She gave him a faint, uncertain smile, the kind of smile that showed a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could rebuild. Maybe they could stop the enemies who had destroyed her world. As Daniel sat back, watching the girl slowly regain her strength, he knew their journey was far from over. They had no idea what lay ahead, who the enemies were, what they wanted, or how to stop them. But for now, they had each other, and that was enough to keep going. Days passed, and Daniel and Lyra found themselves in a small hidden settlement. It was a place far from the chaos, but even here there was a sense of unease. The quiet was almost unnatural, like the calm before a storm. As Lyra's wounds began to heal, she regained some strength, though her memories were still clouded with the loss of her people. She had become a shadow of her former self, lost in a world that no longer had a place for her. Daniel, on the other hand, felt the weight of the promise he made to her. He had promised to help, to protect her, but he had no idea what that meant or how he would do it. The questions were endless. Who were the attackers? What did they want with Lyra's people? And why was Lyra the only one left? The answers seemed to lie somewhere far beyond this small settlement. They couldn't stay here forever. The attackers would eventually come looking for Lyra, and they had to know what to expect if they wanted to survive. It was early morning, when the first sign of trouble appeared. Daniel had just finished preparing a meal when Lyra suddenly tensed, her eyes wide with fear. She had been sitting quietly by the window, watching the sky with an expression of deep sadness, when the distant sound of engines filled the air. Lyra stood up quickly, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "They're coming," she whispered, her voice trembling. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. "Who?" "The ones who destroyed us," Lyra said, her voice quiet but firm. "They are searching for me." Daniel's stomach twisted. He knew this day might come, but the realization that the attackers were near was overwhelming. He had to act quickly. Without a word, Daniel grabbed his gear, quickly throwing on his pack and motioning for Lyra to follow. They had to leave before the enemies found them. They couldn't risk being caught unprepared. As they hurried through the small settlement, Daniel's mind raced. He had no weapons, no means of defending themselves. His best hope was to get them to safety, somewhere, far from the settlement. There was a small outpost to the east, a place he'd heard about during his travels, but it was miles away, and they didn't have much time. "We can't stay here," Daniel said, his voice urgent. "We have to go now." Lyra nodded, her face pale but determined. She had already lost everything, her home, her family, her people. She wasn't going to let them take her again. She couldn't. Together, they ran, pushing through the dense forest and rocky terrain. Daniel's legs ached, and the weight of the pack made each step feel heavier than the last. But he didn't slow down. He couldn't afford to. Lyra was right, behind him, moving with surprising speed, though she stumbled every now and then. Her injuries were still healing, but she was strong, stronger than Daniel had anticipated. As they moved deeper into the forest, Daniel heard the unmistakable sound of engines in the distance growing louder by the second. The attackers were getting closer. They had to make it to the outpost before they were caught. The forest was dense, the trees towering above them, their branches blocking out the sunlight. It was eerily quiet except for the sound of their feet crunching on the dry ground. The world felt distant, as though nothing else existed except for the two of them and the pursuit that was closing in. "What do we do once we get there?" Lyra asked, her voice strained from the exertion. "How do we stop them?" Daniel looked at her, his eyes narrowing in thought. "I don't know yet," he admitted, "but we can't give up. We'll figure something out." They pressed on, their only goal now being to reach the outpost. But with every passing moment, the sound of the engines grew louder, and Daniel could feel his heart pounding harder in his chest. He couldn't outrun them forever. After what felt like an eternity, they finally reached the outpost. It wasn't much, just a small, abandoned military station that had been left behind after the war had ended. The place had been untouched for years, hidden from the world. Daniel knew it well, having visited it during his past journeys. It was the perfect place to hide, if they could make it inside without being spotted. They hurried to the entrance, but just as Daniel was about to press the button to open the door, a voice shouted from behind them. "Stop!" Daniel froze, turning around to see a figure emerging from the trees. It was a tall, armored figure, its face hidden behind a helmet. The attacker was holding a weapon, aimed directly at Daniel. Lyra stepped in front of him, her body tense, ready to fight. "No," she whispered. "Don't do it, they want me." Daniel didn't have time to argue. He knew they couldn't fight. They weren't equipped for this kind of confrontation. The armored figure took a step forward, its weapon still aimed at them. "You think you can escape? The hunt has only just begun." Daniel's mind raced. What should he do? How could he protect Lyra? Suddenly, Lyra took a step forward, her eyes burning with intensity. "You won't take me again," she said, her voice low but filled with power. The figure hesitated, seemingly taken aback by her words. Daniel could see that something was happening, something strange, almost otherworldly. Lyra's eyes were glowing faintly, and the air around her seemed to shimmer. "You don't understand," the figure said, its voice distorted through the helmet. "You are the last of your kind. You are the key to everything." Lyra's expression darkened. "I don't care what I am not your weapon." Before Daniel could react, there was a sudden, sharp noise, like a crack in the air, and the figure staggered back, a blast of energy rushing from Lyra's body. The figure fell to the ground, its weapon falling from its hands. For a moment there was silence. The only sound was the hum of the outpost systems, still running quietly in the background. Daniel stared in shock at Lyra. What had just happened? Lyra lowered her hands, her breathing shallow, and turned to Daniel. "We need to go," she said quietly, her voice shaky. "They won't stop until they have what they want." Daniel nodded, his mind still racing. He didn't fully understand what had just happened, but it didn't matter. They had a chance, an opening. They had to move before the enemy could regroup. As they entered the outpost and sealed the doors behind them, Daniel couldn't help but feel a sense of dread. They had just narrowly escaped, but this was only the beginning. The enemy wasn't going to stop until they had what they wanted, and now it seemed that Lyra was the key to it all. "We'll figure this out," Daniel said, though he wasn't sure how. "We'll survive." But in the back of his mind, he couldn't shake the feeling that the real battle was only just beginning. The outpost was eerily quiet after the blast. The only sound in the room was the soft hum of the power systems, which still seemed to function as if nothing had happened. Daniel stood motionless for a few moments, his mind struggling to catch up with everything that had just occurred. The attacker lay unconscious on the ground, his armor dented and scorched from the blast. Lyra stood a few feet away, her eyes dark, her hands still trembling from the power she had just unleashed. Daniel approached cautiously, unsure of what to say. He had never seen anything like it before. He knew Lyra was different, but he hadn't realized just how different. The energy she had released wasn't something a normal person, alien or human, could do. It was something extraordinary, something dangerous. "Lyra," Daniel began, his voice soft but filled with concern. "What was that? What did you just do?" She didn't immediately respond. Instead, she walked over to the fallen figure and knelt beside him, carefully pulling a small device from his armor. It looked like a communication tool, but it was more advanced than anything Daniel had seen. It was sleek, with intricate designs carved into its surface, glowing faintly with an otherworldly light. "I didn't mean to do it," Lyra said, her voice quiet, almost apologetic. "I didn't want to hurt him, I don't know what happened. When he said those words, something inside me, I couldn't stop it." Daniel watched her for a moment, still processing everything. He had 1,000 questions, but he didn't ask them yet. He needed to understand what Lyra was going through first. "What did he mean?" Daniel asked. "About you being the key to everything? And why are they after you?" Lyra looked up from the device, her eyes filled with both sorrow and confusion. "I don't know, I don't understand it. My people, my colony, were peaceful. We never wanted trouble. But then one day they came. These enemies. They attacked us. They destroyed everything." She paused, her voice breaking slightly. "I don't know why they targeted us, but the attackers, they knew something about me. Something I didn't even know." Daniel's heart sank as he realized just how much Lyra had been carrying. She was the last of her people, and now it seemed like she was being hunted for reasons she didn't understand. "I'm sorry, Lyra," Daniel said, his voice sincere, "but you're not alone anymore. I'll help you figure this out, whatever it takes." Lyra didn't respond right away. Instead, she focused on the device in her hands. Her fingers traced over the surface as though she was trying to decipher something hidden within. After a few moments, the device activated, displaying a series of symbols on a holographic screen. They were unfamiliar, but there was something about them that made Daniel's blood run cold. What is this? Daniel asked, leaning in closer. Lyra's face tightened with realization. This is a map of the galaxy. But it's not just any map. It's a map to something ancient, something powerful, something my people hid before the war, my colony. We were entrusted with guarding it. Daniel's mind raced. A hidden, powerful artifact? It sounded like something out of an old legend, but he knew better than to dismiss it. Lyra's people had been peaceful, yes, but they had been guarding something, and it seemed the enemies weren't just after Lyra. They were after whatever her people had been protecting. Guarding what? Daniel asked. What exactly did your people hide? Lyra looked down at the device, her fingers still tracing the symbols. I don't know everything. I was too young when the council told us about it. But they spoke of an ancient power, a force that could change the course of the galaxy. It was hidden in a place so secret, even the galaxy's most powerful factions couldn't find it. Daniel frowned. So they attacked your colony because they were searching for this force, and they knew you were the key. Lyra nodded, her eyes distant. Yes, they believed I could lead them to it. I didn't know what it was, but I know now. They won't stop until they have it. Daniel paced back and forth, processing the new information. This wasn't just a random attack. This was a hunt for something much more dangerous. The fact that Lyra was somehow tied to it made her an even bigger target. She wasn't just the last survivor of her people. She was the key to finding something ancient, something that could change everything. We can't stay here much longer, Daniel said, his voice steady with determination. They'll come looking for him. And if they know about this map, they'll come after you too. Lyra looked up at him, her eyes filled with worry. Where do we go? How do we stop them? Daniel paused for a moment. The weight of the situation pressed heavily on his chest. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing. They couldn't keep running. They needed to figure out what this force was and what role Lyra played in it. The galaxy wasn't safe anymore, and they had to act fast. There's a place, Daniel said after a few moments of thought. A research facility on the outskirts of the colony. It's not far from here. They might have more information about this map, and it could help us understand what your people were guarding. Lyra looked at him, her expression both hopeful and wary. You think we can find the answers there? I don't know, Daniel said honestly, but it's our best shot. They both fell silent for a moment, the weight of the situation sinking in. The path ahead was uncertain, and the stakes were higher than either of them could have imagined. But one thing was clear. They were in this together. As they gathered their things and prepared to leave the outpost, Daniel glanced at the unconscious attacker. He would have to be dealt with. Leaving him alive could pose a threat, but they couldn't afford to waste time. The enemy was already closing in. Let's go, Daniel said, his voice filled with quiet resolve. We need to move fast. Lyra nodded, standing up and heading toward the door. But as she passed Daniel, she hesitated for a moment. She turned to him, her eyes filled with gratitude. Thank you, she whispered, for everything. Daniel looked at her, a sense of responsibility rising within him. You don't have to thank me. We're in this together. Together, they stepped into the unknown, the weight of their journey pressing down on them. They didn't know what they would find at the research facility, but one thing was certain. Their lives were about to change forever, and whatever they discovered, they would face it side by side. The journey to the research facility was long and tense. Daniel and Lyra moved cautiously through the dense forest, keeping to the shadows and avoiding the roads. Every sound seemed amplified in the silence, the faint rustling of leaves or the snap of a twig underfoot sending them into alert mode. The weight of what they were carrying, the map, the knowledge, and the attackers on their tail, was heavy on both of them. They had to make it to the facility, but the question was, what would they find there? Lyra's people had hidden something powerful, something that had caused this entire chain of events. Daniel couldn't shake the thought that the enemies were not just after Lyra, but after something much more dangerous, As they approached the research facility, a small building nestled in the heart of the forest, the atmosphere grew tense. The building looked abandoned, just as Daniel had remembered it from his previous travels. It was an old research center, used during the early years of Earth's interactions with alien species. Once the war had ended, it had been left to decay. "We're almost there," Daniel said, glancing at Lyra. She was still walking beside him, her face set in a determined expression. But her eyes, those glowing eyes, betrayed the worry she was trying to hide. She had already lost so much, and now, the entire galaxy seemed to be after her. Daniel wasn't sure what they were going to find, but he knew it would be a turning point. They approached the facility's entrance cautiously. The heavy metal door was rusted, and the keypad was damaged, but Daniel managed to bypass it with ease, his skills coming in handy once again. He motioned for Lyra to follow him as he pushed the door open, and they slipped inside. The inside of the facility was cold and dark, filled with abandoned equipment and outdated technology. There was a smell of mildew and dust, the remnants of a place long forgotten. Lyra's steps were quiet behind him as they moved through the hallways, their footsteps echoing in the silence. They came to a large central room that had been left mostly untouched. The walls were lined with old data consoles and storage units, most of which were in disrepair. But in the center of the room, there was a large, sealed door. It looked different from the rest of the facility. It was new, far more advanced than anything else in the building. "This must be it," Daniel said softly, running his fingers along the cool surface of the door. He could feel the weight of it as if it were holding something far more important than just data. He looked at Lyra, his expression serious. "Are you ready for this?" Lyra took a deep breath, her eyes fixed on the door. "I don't know what we're going to find in there, but I need to know the truth." Together, they stepped forward, and Daniel activated the access panel beside the door. It buzzed to life, and after a few moments of quiet clicking, the door slowly began to open. As the door slid open with a soft hiss, Daniel's heart raced. What was inside? The room beyond was filled with holographic projections and interactive consoles. It was a control center, but it looked like nothing Daniel had ever seen before. At the far end of the room, a large central display hummed to life, revealing an ancient-looking alien map. It wasn't just a map of space. It was something more, something that seemed to resonate with power. Daniel approached it slowly, his fingers brushing against the interface. The map flickered, and symbols began to appear. Symbols that seemed strangely familiar. They matched the ones on the device Lyra had carried earlier. But now the symbols were clearer, showing something far beyond what they had expected. "This is it," Lyra whispered, stepping beside him. "This is what they were looking for. This is the location." The map displayed a series of coordinates, but they were far from anything on Earth. They pointed to a distant planet, deep in uncharted space. Lyra's people had hidden something there, something powerful enough to change the course of the galaxy. Daniel studied the map for a moment. "So this is where it all leads. But why didn't your people stop them? Why didn't they protect it better?" Lyra's eyes darkened and her voice became quiet. "We didn't know. We didn't know the power that was hidden there. We were guardians, but we didn't understand the full extent of what we were protecting. Now I think they've found it." As if on cue, the ground beneath their feet suddenly trembled, and the lights in the facility flickered. The sound of engines filled the air once again. This time it wasn't distant, it was close. Too close. "They're here," Daniel muttered, his mind racing. He looked at Lyra, his expression filled with urgency. "We need to move now." Lyra's eyes widened. "They found us, they found the map." "Not just the map," Daniel said quickly, his hand already reaching for the nearby console. "They're after the power. We have to stop them." Before Lyra could respond, the sound of heavy boots echoed through the hallway outside the room. The attackers were closing in. They had no time to waste. Daniel grabbed Lyra's arm and pulled her toward the back of the room, where a small escape hatch lay hidden beneath a pile of debris. It wasn't much, but it was their only way out. As they rushed toward it, the door to the main room exploded open, and several armored figures stormed inside. They were the same ones Daniel had seen before, but now they were more determined, more ruthless. "Get down," Daniel shouted, pushing Lyra to the ground as the attackers opened fire. The air filled with the sharp sound of gunfire as Daniel scrambled for cover. Lyra, despite her injuries, was on her feet in an instant, her eyes glowing with intensity. She moved quickly, faster than Daniel had seen her move before. There was a power in her now, a fire that hadn't been there when they first met. She raised her hand and a blast of energy shot from her fingertips, striking one of the attackers square in the chest. He crumpled to the ground, his armor smoking from the impact. "Stay down," Daniel shouted, but Lyra was already on her feet, her eyes locked onto the remaining attackers. She moved with incredible speed, dodging their fire and striking back with energy blasts of her own. The attackers seemed surprised by the power she was unleashing. Daniel watched in awe as she fought, her movements fluid and precise, her body glowing with energy. It was clear now that Lyra wasn't just a survivor. She was a force to be reckoned with. But despite her power, there were still too many of them. The attackers regrouped, closing in on them from all sides. Daniel knew they couldn't keep fighting forever. They needed a plan. "We need to get to that ship," Daniel said, pulling Lyra toward the hatch. "Now." Together they made their way through the maze of corridors, evading the attackers as best they could. The sounds of battle were distant now, but Daniel could feel the pressure building. They were running out of time. Finally, they reached the hangar at the back of the facility. It was small, but there was a ship inside. A ship that had been left behind long ago. It wasn't much, but it was enough to get them out of here. "Get in," Daniel yelled as he ran toward the controls. Lyra hesitated for a moment, her eyes still focused on the map, but she didn't argue. She climbed into the co-pilot seat, her fingers twitching with energy. The attackers were closing in, but now they had one advantage: the element of surprise. With the sound of engines roaring to life, Daniel punched the throttle, and the ship blasted into the sky, leaving the facility and the chaos behind them as they ascended into the stars. Daniel looked at Lyra, who was staring out the window, her face a mixture of determination and fear. They had made it out, for now. But the war was far from over. The attackers would come for them again, and they would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. "We're not done yet," Daniel said, his voice calm but filled with certainty. Lyra turned to him, her eyes meeting his for the first time since the battle. "No," she said softly. "We're just getting started."